Hi, my name is Archana Bahuguna. This presentation is geared towards beginners who want to learn how to build web apps using Flask, a Python micro framework. What is a web app? A web app is a service hosted on a web server and accessed either through the internet over the HTTP protocol. Is Microsoft PowerPoint a web application? No. MS PowerPoint is an application that is running on your PC's Windows operating system. However, Google Docs, for example, is a web application because it is being hosted on the web server and you are accessing it over the HTTP protocol. So typically what you do is you have a client on your PC or your server or something from where you're accessing. You want to access a service, a web service or a web application. And typically it is a browser like Chrome or Safari, or Safari is on your iPhone, or Firefox or anything like that. And your applications, the web applications, are hosted on web servers. And for example, if you want to access the Google search engine, we type google.com on the browser, and an HTTP request is sent to the web server, and the web server responds back with the information that is required on the page. For example, we get a text box on which we can type the string that we need to search. So that's an example of how we are accessing the web application over the internet, and all this is happening on top of the TCP/IP stack using the HTTP protocol. What is HTTP? HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's basically a method of communication which is defined between how a web client and web servers are supposed to communicate. So for example, when you type an address on a client browser, say google.com, there is a GET request that is sent from the client browser to the web server, and the web server responds back with the page that you want to be that you see getting loaded when you type google.com, for example. That is the response, that's the data that the web server is responding with. But at the same time, it is also sending it, and it is doing this using an HTTP protocol. So it is supposed to send back an HTTP response. For example, there is a status code, say 200 OK, if everything goes well. There is if you requested a service that could not be found, for example, or if you were not authorized to access a service, you would receive a message, say 404 not found, or 401 unauthorized. So typically when you are trying to access a web application, you are sending an HTTP request to the web server, and the web server is responding with the HTTP response. The requests and responses normally have a header and a body. You can refer to RFC 2616 online if you want to know more about HTTP. There are 4 methods of accessing a web service on a being hosted on a web server. There are many methods, but these are the most popular, which is like get, post, put, and delete. Get is typically used if you just want to access information which is already there. Post is used if you want to modify the information on the server or add new information to the server. Put is actually supposed to be used to modify information, but is also used to put new information sometimes. Delete is when you want to delete information, some information that you can from a server. These are the 4 basic common methods that are used over HTTP when we have these applications being accessed. So as a web developer, we will be working on the backend side. So we can, the web app has a front end, which is what we see when we are a web client and we are typing an address, and whatever gets populated on the browser is actually the front end of a web app. There is a backend of the web app which is being hosted on a web server, which is providing all the functionality, all the routing, all the functionality which enables us to see what we see when we access a website, for example. As we have already mentioned, the information exchange happens only over HTTP. We type a URL. The most common function of a web server is to route that URL or map that URL onto a functionality or a function or a method inside which is written for your application. So as an app developer, what you will be you're going to be focused on the functionality of what service you want to provide to the app. So for example, if it is a URL shortening service, if that is your app, then all you're doing is writing a small piece of code where you are mapping you want to map the URL that is typed or written by the client, and you just map it to a shorter URL and respond that back through HTTP to the client. So what Flask is doing is that Flask is providing a framework beneath your application, so you don't have to do repeat work. Typically, this is what is done by most frameworks used for web development. So Flask provides URL routing. It processes the HTTP request, or it accesses the HTTP request, which is processed by the Werkzeug toolkit for WSGI, and it also provides a response dictionary. So both request and response are in the form of dictionaries, which typically contain the information that would be there in a HTTP request and in the HTTP response, except that they are in a more human readable format, or in a easily understandable data structure or accessible data structure like a dictionary. So when you're actually running Flask on your system, basically there is this, so you have your TCP/IP stack, your OS, which is running, and then on top of that you have a Werkzeug layer, followed by a Flask layer, and then on the right on top of everything is your application. The application accesses Flask through a method call, and the Flask can access Werkzeug also through method calls. Werkzeug basically just provides, or WSGI just basically is a HTTP handler, which handles all the HTTP packets that come to the web server, and they parse the HTTP request and they convert that into a data structure, like I said, the request dictionary, and offer that to Flask, and then Flask offers the whole framework and functionality of routing, of sessions, logins, authentication, and many other such functionalities that most web apps are supposed to have. So all you need to do to develop the app is to just use those functionalities provided by Flask, and then just write the logic or the basic piece of code that you need to implement your own functionality. If you want to install Flask, if you have a Linux box, you can do pip install. You can also use apt-get install, and you are encouraged to use a virtual environment. Basically, what a virtual environment is, that if you are working with different projects, for example, and you're using same Python libraries, and you're using the same libraries, but you want to use different versions of Python, for example, or if you have a Flask framework and you want to use version, like say 2 on one and say 2.1 on the other. I may be incorrect about the versions of Flask, but I'm just giving an example that if you want to use two different versions of Flask for two different apps, it is better that you create a virtual environment first. And what the virtual environment does is that it installs uh, its own version of all the packages that you need to install. And so you get that enclosed space where you can, for virtual environment A, you're using only these particular libraries. And for virtual environment B, you're using some other libraries, and they don't conflict with each other, and you can work on two projects independent of each other without getting stuck with different versions, or some kind of problems like that. So like I said, Workzoic provides the basic request object and response object to Flask. Workzoic is the HTTP request handler. Flask provides URL routing. It comes with Jinja 2 templating, which is a method of, like when you're working with web apps, you're typically responding with HTML files towards the front end. And you want to provide a template. And on top of that, if you want to dynamically change some information, for example, from user 1 to user 2, if you want to change something that gets dynamically displayed based on the input that is coming from your HTTP request, then you can use Jinja 2. It's a very powerful tool that you can use inside your HTML files, allowing you to plug in variables, as well as using looping, like for loops or if conditions and things like that. So it can make your HTML template, it enables your HTML template to vary or dynamically vary with input. Flask also provides redirects, and like I said, provides you the functionality to implement different types of sessions, authentication, etc. So what that means is that if a client is trying to access, wants to, for example, wants to log in, and you don't have to write all that code in your application. Flask is already providing you, and you're just going to use that Flask extension and just write 1 or 2 lines of code to use it. In this presentation, we will start with a very small, basic, minimal Flask application, and then we will move on to a slightly bigger web application, which is a small quiz engine, which I'll be discussing in more detail after this minimal Flask application. So for the minimal Flask application, you need to have Flask installed. You want to, so you import Flask, and then you create an instance of your app. Then you define, so hello world, for example, is basically the functionality that you want to define. So in this app, what we're going to do is we just want to type an address on the browser, and we want our web app to just respond back with hello world. So what we want to do is we say app.route, and in the brackets we put in the name of the text of the URL that we are going to type. And when that URL is typed, and when we press enter on the browser, the control is going to come here to the function def hello world, and is going to return hello world. This hello world inside the quotes is going to be part of the HTTP response. It's going to go into the body of the HTTP message. You can also, so Flask takes care of all the other things, important things in the header. For example, if you are a web app and you have to respond, if you get a request, if you get an HTTP GET request, you have to respond with a status code. You need to have some important headers like content type, I mean lots of type of encoding, and there's a lot of information that goes on into the HTTP header, and that information by default Flask has a default for all of that. So when you send this, when you say this return hello world, this goes into the